Joel or Rambran, a very good morning to you. I'm sorry, Rambran, good to have you on the program. Do you get any calls as yet from members of the government asking you why you're giving this gloomy forecast coming into election year?
Not as yet.
Not as yet, but is it as gloomy as it appears based on what you are suggesting from the data?
I would say it is certainly one that has disappointed, given our expectations earlier at the start of the year. What we need to bear in mind, as I've indicated during my speech, is that there continues to be a bright spot in the economy, which is the performance of the non-energy sector. And I think that's an area that we have to concentrate on, because the more that we provide the incentives for greater performance, and we continue the diversification thrust, then you're likely to see the non-energy sector taking more of a leading role in driving the TNT economy forward.
But given the present ratio of reliance on the energy sector, how realistic is the expectation that even a phenomenal growth of the non-energy sector can compensate for what appears to be a decline in the energy sector?
Yeah, but that's more of a longer-term process. But as I indicated, despite what is the gloomy news, it's important, one, that we focus on what is likely to happen next year. And as the other part is this, we focus in on the fact that growth has disappointed. It has been much slower than we thought it would be. But at the same time, that is not, to me, the major risk to our economic outlook as we move into 2015. The major risk will come from what happens in the United States when the U.S. Fed starts to raise interest rates.
Okay. Explain how that will translate into whatever challenges we may face.
What is happening now is that the global economy has been accustomed for almost 8 years with a flood of liquidity, because the advanced countries like the United States, the regions like Europe, they've lowered interest rates basically to what is called the zero bar. And with that, they engage in what was called quantitative easing, meaning they've been flooding liquidity throughout their financial system. That liquidity has to find a home, and much of that went into emerging markets like Trinidad and Tobago. Now that the U.S. has signaled that quantitative easing has come to an end, is going to pull back that liquidity. Sometime around summer of next year, the U.S. Fed is likely to start raising interest rates. That particular part to where interest rates start to move means that U.S. dollar assets are going to be a lot more attractive to global investors than assets elsewhere, non-U.S. dollar assets, including assets in Trinidad and Tobago. So what you could see from now into summer and almost into the rest of next year is that the global financial markets are going to react. The expectations are going to change. You're going to see a lot of volatility in the market as we tread along that path. And it means that capital movements are going to become volatile. So capital flows that may have come to a country like Trinidad and Tobago could actually take a pause, could actually slow. Then you would have investors here in Trinidad looking and saying, well, I could actually get higher returns in the United States, and money could start to move out from Trinidad to the U.S.
There are a number of issues here. We're talking about, an economy that is driven heavily by government spending. We have a private sector that is being encouraged to take on a greater responsibility. But I just want to touch on the oil price situation. Sure. What does this suggest? Because I think yesterday it hit a 5-year low before bouncing back up a little bit. That's Brent crude, which is seen as a benchmark. What does this portend for our economy for 2015?
What is important with the fall in oil prices, again, is that we've always used the oil price as a psychological barometer of how well we feel. But the oil price is not the main barometer now. We are a natural gas-based economy, and it's important that we focus a lot more on what is happening with natural gas prices. We became a natural gas-based economy in 1996. That's almost 2 decades ago. Yet we continue to focus so heavily on the oil price, because we've been conditioned to do that with almost more than 100 years of history in oil. When we look at natural gas prices, which is the marker for the budget is called the Henry Hub natural gas price. That's the price base for exports into the United States. We export less than 10% of our natural gas-based products into the U.S. Therefore, that is not the relevant market price, but it's the most conservative price in a sense that the Ministry of Finance would use. We export LNG to South America, to the Middle East, to Asia, and to Europe. So we have a diversified basket of LNG exports. Therefore, we receive different prices in the different regions. When we aggregate those prices, tally them up, and take an average, that price, the term used is called the netback 0.14 LNG price. And essentially that price is somewhere now at around $5.50.
How does that compare?
Double what is the budgeted price. Right? Our estimates at the central bank show that that price would have to fall by 50%, obviously down to $2.75 to match Henry Hub for an extended period of time for there to be a significant impact on energy revenues.
But having said that, we had the finance minister last week announcing a reduction in allocations to the ministries to the extent of $45 million. That suggests that the fall in the oil prices, while I take your point, because we've been told by the experts that natural gas is what really drives our economy, it does appear that the fall in the oil prices is having a real impact on government revenues.
No, what it means is that the minister is being prudent. He's starting to prune out some expenditure. But remember, $45 million in the context of a $66 billion budget. Right? That's a
$45 million per ministry.
Right? Yeah. It's $1.3 billion.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So it is not as significant a cut. But what it does is that he sends the right signal that he's prepared, right, to cut expenditure to match his revenue shortfalls. And I think that's the right message that he's sending.
Should we be worried about the fact that the energy sector has not performed to expectations? And have you gotten any indications as to precisely why, or is there any sort of suggestion that that could change for the better in 2015?
From our analysis, what we've seen is that it could change. It could bring some level of stability into 2015. When we looked at what had happened in 2013, and you might remember in September 2013, we had the largest maintenance shutdown that took place. After that shutdown, when we spoke to the energy companies, what they indicated was that would be the last major shutdown. As we moved into 2014, the situation would normalize. And that did not happen, and that is why the growth forecast had such a significant deviation. There were a number of unplanned shutdowns and planned shutdowns across the energy sector, and that hit production significantly, especially production of liquefied natural gas and production of natural gas, which are the two main drivers of growth in the energy sector.
Is that an infrastructural problem? Is it that the equipment needs to be significantly upgraded, and as a result of that, you do have these planned and unplanned shutdowns?
No, it's less around. It's the planned shutdowns are always around just ensuring your infrastructure is on the right path. It's the unplanned ones which deal with particular issues or challenges that each company may face at a different point in time that they have to deal with, and that's very specific to the company. It's when you aggregate it that you start to see what the full picture looks like. So one company may actually be running very smoothly, and another would have a shutdown and may last 3-4 days. But when you take the numbers into account and the spillovers that happen, because if a natural gas producer, let's say like either BP or BG, those are two main producers, if they shut down, what you'll find is that Atlantic LNG may then decide to also go on a pause because the supplies are not coming. If that, then you'll find methanol producers, ammonia producers may then also say, all right, I'll hold off a bit because I'm not getting the supply that's needed. And that causes this ripple effect throughout the energy sector. And I think that's what we need to bear in mind. The sector too is well integrated. And therefore what happens with one company has an impact throughout the rest of the industry.
Governor, what is all of this going to mean as far as the ordinary citizen and their expectations as far as the economic performance and how it's going to affect them in 2015?
I think it's important that we need to start to adjust expectations downwards in the sense that...
Meaning what?
Meaning that we have to bear in mind that the external environment itself is one that is, as I have termed it, a murkier environment as we move into 2015. There are a lot of moving parts with different degrees of uncertainty. I spoke about what's happening in the United States in terms of its own central bank raising interest rates. You look at other major regions like Europe. The Eurozone is basically in a very fragile state. You look at an economy that's been helping to drive growth for much of the last decade, China. China is in a 5-year slowdown. You look at some of the geopolitical risks. We started the year with Russia and Ukraine conflict. That hasn't gone, that hasn't abated. It's quite likely that could escalate. We then encountered the Ebola virus, and then we saw the rise of ISIS and the particular attack. So what is happening is that you have a number of geopolitical risks that are also mounting that have the potential to also impact activity in the Caribbean and therefore by extension Trinidad and Tobago. So it is an environment that's certainly going to be a lot harsher. You have the situation of falling oil prices. Quite likely, if those fall again for extended period, some of the natural gas prices are going to take a hit, and we have to make further adjustments on the budget side. So it means, yes, you have to take that into account, that very more sobering outlook into account as you move into 2015.
Yet we are heading into a period of high expenditure. This is the Christmas season. This is the busiest season commercially, not just for us here in Trinidad and Tobago, but for most of the Western world, followed by Carnival, which is another high expenditure sort of period. How difficult will it be for the average consumer to be able to rein in their usually and their regular expenditure at this time of the year, given your call for maybe some greater restraint?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to at least temper that a bit. But remember, I started the discussion talking about the non-energy sector performance. A lot of what you're speaking to is actually what's happening in the non-energy sector, particularly in retail and distribution. On the government side will be the activity in the construction sector that provides the support that's needed. So you still need a lot of that expenditure, a lot of that spending to take place to give us that level of comfort and stability that we'll need. At the same time, it cannot be one of exuberance. It has to be one that is tempered.
And in that context, I know, I mean, I don't want to get in trouble with the commercial banks, but this is a time when there's all these loan sales and encouraging people to borrow and borrow and borrow. As with any business, you want people to spend, to invest their money. What would you say to the average consumer when faced with these attractive options of borrowing to do whatever you want to do?
Just ensure you don't hang your hat where you can't reach it.
Do we have that discipline? Are you satisfied that we have that sort of fiscal discipline?
No. Well, for the average consumer, the answer would basically be no, and that is why we have institutions like the Financial Inclusion Development Agency at the Central Bank that provides that level of financial education and financial literacy to the population. And that's where institutions like that will become even more important as we move into next year.
No one is suggesting that we may go the way of the housing crisis that basically triggered all of the global economic crisis in 2008, when basically lending organizations were lending money to people who basically couldn't pay, and that created a crisis. Could we have a mini sort of crisis if it is that people, because of the time of the year, extending themselves way too far, and come February, March, April, they can't pay?
No, not at all. I mean, that's still short term. But I think we do have to look at the fact that consumer lending has been the fastest driver in the lending portfolio for commercial banks. And the flip side to that means that consumers are obviously taking on more debt. In a situation where interest rates are rising, we now have to look at, do you have the ability to service debt, right, in relation to what your income level looks like? And I think that's why I said consumers have to take maybe a second look at where they are and make a particular decision. Do I delay taking on that particular loan, or do I try to negotiate better terms, or do I simply say no to it?
And in that context, as you said, you know, we always use the phrase buyer beware. Consumers need to apprise them. Should there be a responsibility on the other side as far as the enticements and the inducements to get into debt. As I said, people are in business, but should there be a responsibility on that side as well?
Yeah, there's always a responsibility. I think the banks all typically would exercise that responsibility.
And moving into 2015, with all of these considerations, it does appear to be a quite gloomy picture. Do you see, you talked about the non-energy sector, and that being a long-term thing to transform our economy. Are you seeing any encouraging signs that could suggest that it may not, that could mitigate the impact of all of these issues that you're talking about?
Certainly. If you look at the agricultural sector, for example, over the last 5 years, that is the one sector that has shown pretty consistent growth after almost, 30 years of being in the doldrums. So production has been steadily picking up. And I think that's an area that government should pay particular attention to and a lot of focus, because it has the capability, one, to help lower the food import bill, therefore you save foreign exchange. It also has the capability of generating export earnings. It has the capability to help in food sovereignty, and it will certainly help in the fight against food price inflation.
And we're talking about, we always look forward to these contributions by the central bank governor to give us a sense of where the economy is at. And based on this experience, a forecast of 2.5%, in reality it's turned out to be just 0.5%. How is that going to temper this, your own reports and your own assessments moving forward? Because some might be wondering, I wonder if the next time the central bank governor says something, we have to wait until a few months later to find out what is the real story.
As it is, Fazir, a forecast is just that. It's a forecast based on particular assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions will pan out how you thought they would. Sometimes they don't at all. And sometimes they go maybe halfway. Right? So it's assumption. That's forecasting. That's the nature of forecasting.
Is it based on like being optimistic or pessimistic as well? Does that come into the equation?
Actually, at the central bank, we do three versions of the forecast. We do optimistic, baseline, and pessimistic.
So did you
to try and cover? And strange enough, the scenario that we're talking about now matches our pessimistic.
The pessimistic forecast.
Yes.
So should we expect a pessimistic forecast the next time around?
Yeah, but what we usually do in giving the forecast public is that we give you the baseline. We give you, on the basis of unchanged policies, this is likely to happen. We won't tell you what is the optimistic and the pessimistic range.
Sure. How reliable are the indicators that you would use, or does that suggest, based on this experience, that you need to maybe have another look at the indicators before coming up with it?
I think most of these indicators are reliable, particularly ones in the energy sector. They're based on actual production. The ones on the non-energy sector, I think, as you may know, both the CSO and the central bank, when the process, are rebasing our GDP estimates, and that means we have to take account of the structural changes that have taken place in the economy over the last decade or so that we could get better estimates as we move ahead.
How reliable is the data as far as you're concerned?
I would say it's generally very reliable, but we have significant room to make improvements, and that is why you may see that the central bank had indicated it would be bringing out 3 major data sets over the course of the year. One on a business confidence survey to supplement what we already have, 2, a consumer confidence survey, which will be released before the end of this year, and the 3rd is a labor market confidence survey, which will happen early next year.
Governor, you know the classic God is a Trini syndrome, that we feel, well, as bad as it might sound, we'll ride through it in the same way that with the global economic crash, essentially, we felt we were pretty well insulated by that. There may be an element of complacency still, even with the information that you have provided. What would you say to the wider population of Trinidad and Tobago looking ahead to 2015?
Well, the God is a Trini syndrome in economics really means having the right policy response to what you see coming down in the pike. And the central bank is always the first line of defense against external shocks hitting the economy. And what we're seeking to do is to insulate the economy from those shocks. That's why we have raised the repo rate at 2 consecutive meetings of the Monetary Policy Committee, and that means we are looking to ensure that we could protect the economy, protect our economic house as we see these challenges coming down the road.
Based on the data available, do you get the sense that consumers generally respond or react to advisories from the central bank, or are they still, their pattern of behavior remains consistent throughout?
No, there's usually, you will find a response. It wouldn't be an immediate response because it has to feed through the system. The monetary policy actions we take must feed through the system. But you will see eventually, as we maybe into the middle of next year, that there is a response, that they do temper behavior, that expectations are adjusted.
How much of that, all of that though, is ultimately dependent on government prudence? And you highlighted the fact that the finance minister is showing that by his advisory. Is that ultimately the guide that will guide consumers along?
Right. Both sides. It means that both monetary and fiscal policy has to be coordinated and has to be aligned. And at the moment, that is exactly what is happening. You're seeing that level of coordination alignment taking place. But
Governor, we are heading into an election year when there is going to be a preoccupation with the politics. And I'm sure government, as any government, will be tempted to do certain things, promise certain things, want to deliver on certain things, which are not prudent in the present environment. Is that going to be a difficult situation for us?
And that is where monetary policy steps in. That's where the central bank steps in. But at the same time, we are not the only game in town, and there is a limit to how far we can take monetary policy.
You think
but we are there to do what is needed to be done to protect the economy.
You think the politicians are going to be listening to you heading into 2015?
They should be listening.
And if they don't, what are the consequences for us?
No, it might be what are the consequences for the politicians.
but because, and you understand the reality, of course.
Yes, that's the reality.
That they may, you know, I mean, politicians, as I said, you know, even if they had a conversation with you, you wouldn't tell me. But the reality is that they will say, look, there's an election to win. And to say, now it's time to ban your belly, it's a little gloomy. These are not the messages that you want to be giving the electorate heading into an election year.
And that is for the politicians to see about. My job as central bank governor, as I said, is to ensure that this economy is protected and insulated from the shocks that it faces.
So, and before we conclude, when can we expect your next public utterance or report on the state of our economy?
Our next monetary policy forum would be in May of 2015.
May of 2015, after Carnival, heading up to an election, could be quite interesting. Governor Ramran, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for seeing.
As always, to give us your perspective, your frank and very informed perspective on the performance of our economy. So the sky may not be falling, but we certainly need to be very, very cautious in this